Because empathy, thank you, Ian. The topic of empathy has been raised over the years in relation to ID and whether or not there's a connection between your ID and the either your ability to be empathic, or is there a different type of empathy that is shown depending on your ID. So that's what we're going to dig into today. So in terms of the invitation, like these were the things that we spoke about in the invitation that we would cover. Just so you know, if you're new to this, after the webinar, we send out the slides that we're using today. So any slide that you see will be included in the pack that we send you when you get the link. But there will also potentially be some slides that I won't spend a lot of time on today, but I'm putting them into the deck so you've got them there as a resource. But it's not where I really want to spend a lot of our time. But I think later, if you were studying this deck, they would be good additional resource for you. So let's dig into this topic of empathy. Well, first of all, let's start with the definition so we're all on the same page. So I'm just grabbing this straight out of the dictionary, but I found it interesting when I first saw it because it talks about the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. And so on the one hand, you've got a cognitive dimension, which is the understanding. That's like the intellectual side. And then you've also got an affective side, which is the feeling side. And they're different. You know, just because you understand doesn't mean you necessarily feel, and vice versa. So when you dig into a little deeper, I thought I'd just, give you a broader definition. Empathy is the ability to emotionally understand, again, I find that interesting, what other people feel, see things from their point of view, which is also a cognitive thing, and imagine yourself in their place. Essentially, it's putting yourself in someone else's position and feeling what they are feeling. Okay, one more. The difference between empathy, sympathy, and compassion. We're not going to dig into this too much today. Our job here today is not to get into the academic definitions, but I just thought for anyone that might want to use this tech later as a resource, this might be a question that comes up. What's the difference? And so you can see here the way it's explained is that with sympathy, compassion, there is an important difference in as much as that they're a passive connection, whereas empathy generally involves a more active attempt to understand another person. So I just thought I'd start by giving you these definitions, but I will say, knowing what we know about ID, this sets up a conflict right from or a confusion, at least right from the start. This concept of understanding and being able to rationalize on the one hand, which is very cognitive, versus for a lot of people that feel that they're more empathic, it's just a feeling that they have that sometimes is very unexplainable. So let's dig into that as we go through today's session and bring ID into the mix. Why is empathy so important? So let's look at it from a leadership point of view, given that most of us are in a workplace environment, and whether we have an explicit leadership role or aspire to have a leadership role or just want to be more influential amongst the people that we work with. Here's what happens when you have empathy. And look, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just some of the things that come out when people show empathy, and we'll look at what happens when you don't. So one of the things that's really important at the moment, and this is a big issue for many companies as we work more virtually, is how do we keep things human? And particularly now with AI, there's a big movement towards AI. There's a lot of fear around, and where does that leave the human being? And so keeping the human more centric in that equation is a really big focus of a lot of organizations right now. When people feel that there's empathy, they feel like giving you more than what what the job entails. It's no longer just a job. There's a level of heart in this. So there's head and heart, but the heart comes alive when people feel that there's empathy in the equation. And obviously, when it comes to collaboration, which these days is increasingly important, particularly in the subscription and SaaS worlds, where people have to work much more cross-functionally with people that they aren't working with every day and building those connections with, the ability to connect quickly from an empathy perspective has never been more important than what it is today. I'll just show this next piece and then I'll stop for any questions or comments. Without empathy, what happens? Well, if there's not the empathy, it reverts to just being a job. The heart piece is much more out of the equation. And so when people are doing things because it's a job, it's a should, it's a have to, it's much more cognitive, much more obligatory, and there's not that extra mile that people go to go above and beyond. Invariably, people tend to shrink and stay just in the space that feels safe, which is their own silo, which is the exact opposite of how people need to be operating today. And so we are in a world that demands much more empathy than ever before. I might just stop there in case anyone's got a question about that, maybe a different perspective, or even something that validates what we're saying, maybe a personal example where you've experienced empathy versus not empathy and the difference that made for you. Most people are on mute, so if you want to share something, you'll have to go off mute first.
I guess just an observation, Paul. And that is, it sounds to me that what you're describing is there's a higher chance of having sort of psychosocial hazards in the workplace, and having an unpsychologically safe workplace if you're leading without empathy.
Spot on. Spot on. Thank you.
So this is Patricia. I worked for leaders both that have a lot of empathy, and then I worked for one that actually did not. And that was my main reason for leaving the company, was because they did not have any empathy, and I stayed as long as I could. And then it was a matter of, it's time to go. So it does make a huge difference when especially when you've experienced it with a big, a large amount of empathy, and then you go to a leader that has like absolutely none. It's heart-wrenching.
Is this where I apologize, Patricia?
Yes, Paul, please. No, after that I came to you, so.
It's interesting. There's material written on, like, the multiplier and diminisher, that concept, right? So much of that speaks to the difference that there is when there's empathy or not. Like when there is empathy, people that breathes oxygen into the way people show up. And I think so. I don't think there's probably too much disagreement about this. So let's bring the ID into the mix. I know the place where most people want to go is what's the difference with empathy and different IDs? And we will go there in a minute. But before that, there's a couple of other dimensions to ID that aren't just about your own bias of ID or your particular ID that I want to bring into the mix, because these are really, really important. So the first one was a lesson I learned. And I know this is a little bit wordy for a slide presentation, but I wanted it in the deck as a resource for you because I thought this was so profound. There's a lady that we work very closely with at Ohio State University who's a massive proponent of ID, Laurie Kendall. Some of you know her really well. I see Alona, you nodding, and she's just gifted with how she explains the uniqueness of ID. And I was talking to her at one point about, why do you dig into ID? Why did you favor that compared to something like Myers-Briggs or DISC? Because she had a lot of experience with different psychometric frameworks. And this is what she said. She said, Paul, I've been doing this for 35 years, and an absolute passion of mine has been trying to understand what makes a difference in the way people interact. Why are some interactions high quality and some not? And what difference does that interaction make for how teams come together as high performance teams? And what she really said that was profound was, here's what happens. She said, I can't even fully explain this, but it's like when two people get each other and there's that sense of like, you understand me, you know where I'm coming from. There's a biological chemical change that occurs in the way the brain works, where it goes from a fight or flight to a feeling, to your point, Fiona, of psychological safety. The guard comes down and you feel you can just like be yourself. And that correlates with people being more in flow. And so before we even get into ID differences with empathy, something to really understand about the power of ID in the empathy equation is this concept of it allows two people to get each other, no matter how different they are. If there's that awareness and there's that acceptance that we're different, it lowers the guard, and just that creates the space for a more empathic conversation. I think that's really profound. And when people are trying to understand the difference between, ID and other tools, I think this piece, and most people, I'm sure most of you on this call would relate to this, when you know someone's got an ID or you talk through the lens of ID, there's just this thing that happens where you feel safer to speak your truth and show up, for who you are, not who you think you should be. So that's one piece. The second piece that's really profound, if we look at what do you need to do, it's about this whole point about being in stride. Think about what happens if we're out of stride. What's our ability to be empathic then? So we often use this graphic here to show the green arrow. If you're doing life along, like in flow, in stride, in the zone, that's the green arrow, right? So if you are in stride, then not only is it the place of high performance and fulfillment, but what we've found more recently is it's the place where you feel more courageous and confident to not only speak your truth, but to accept that truth from other people. Because if you're not in stride, you're more naturally defensive and resistant and wanting to sort of like validate yourself and turn the conversation into one about yourself, more so than staying focused on the other person. So one of the things that we would say is, before we worry about ID biases, if you want to be truly empathetic to other people, get in stride. It brings the heart, or the possibility for the heart to be in the equation. So some people I know feel like, I don't think I'm a naturally empathetic person. Like, I've been criticized for not having any empathy, and maybe it's just not me to be empathic. And yet what we've got to first check is, but are you in stride? Because no matter what your ID is, if you're not in stride, you're probably going to be struggling to be empathetic. All right. The second thing is, don't be a victim. And this comes about, it's be pretty hard to be a victim if you're really in stride, an 8, 9, or 10 out of 10 on that scale. But I do find that there are people that have a sense of entitlement or being above other people, come from a place of what things should be, as opposed to accepting with gratitude the way things are and being in a place of servant leadership. So I think these are all mindsets that you need to, get in stride, yes, but there are mindsets that are foundational to being, skillful at being empathic with other people. And I think it would be, we'd overlook, an important piece in this framework if we didn't speak to this. This is a really big piece, because it's not a given that no matter what your ID is, like we'll talk in a minute about certain IDs being more empathetic than others, but that doesn't mean that they always are. They've got the potential to be, but if they're not, if they're in a place where they're out of stride, or they're walking around feeling like a victim, then their ID essentially is compromised. Greg, you taught us this years ago, be present, agenda off, attention out, and appreciation on. Like, this is so important to how the other person feels you in the conversation or in the experience. If you're not present and you're not focused on them, if you're worried more about yourself or how what they're sharing is affecting you, hence that defensiveness and resistance piece. And it's very easy to go there, especially when the conversation is about you. But if you've got this principle in mind of being present for them, turn your agenda off, turn the appreciation on, and put the focus on them, you're in a much better place to be empathic. So these are like ground rules for being able to show good empathy. And then there's being aware of the ID bias and, your strengths and vulnerabilities. And that's what we're going to dig into. So first of all, I'm reminding you about this slide. I'm not going to dig into this, but I put this in the deck because I think this is a really great place to start to remind yourself of what is it that other people admire and cherish about you. This is just a good refresher slide. Again, I won't go into it because I want to use the time focus on empathy, but I found this a good resource to include for you. And before we go forward, I do have a question for you. Just to put this on hold for a second. Who here, is there anyone that feels that empathy's not their thing? You know, they've either been criticized for it, so they question whether they're really an empathic person, or they just truly believe that they're not, you know? And this is not a loaded question. I'm genuinely interested in what's the experience of this group. I'm gonna just turn this off for a second while we have this conversation. Is there a, you know, yeah, some people that feel, yeah, it's not my thing, and I'd either like to be better at it, but it hasn't been where I've really played.
Hi, Paul. It's Lucia here.
Hi, Lucia. How are you?
Hi. Good, thank you.
Good.
It's actually quite interesting. This came up in a conversation yesterday as I completed a survey as part of some Better Up coaching that I'm doing as well.
Yep.
And empathy was actually one of my lower scores, the one that to work on. And I was talking to my coach about it, trying to kind of verbalize what it was, and I feel that I don't expect empathy from anyone. I've always been really strong and independent, and just went out and did things, and had no expectations of anyone, whether that is empathy or kindness, or to give me things or provide me with opportunities. I create everything for myself, and I wonder whether I feel like I don't give it because of that as well. I don't know. I don't know if it comes naturally to me.
So just to summarize, are you saying that because you haven't needed it, you therefore maybe don't give it? Like your independence is maybe, it's a two-way street. You don't need it, so you don't, you're independent, so others are, you don't sort of connect at that level?
Yeah, possibly. I think I'm trying to work out why I've scored low that way.
Was
But
it
I
a
mean,
surprise for you?
it's strange because when I receive feedback from my team, some of the words they used to describe me include empathetic. So, and then I think, oh, I'm not being authentic because I don't know if I feel empathetic. Do I just come across that way? But I'm actually not sure if I am. I don't know. It's all very confusing at the moment.
Just get them to redo the survey. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for sharing so openly and honestly. That's the sort of thing that really helps this group, and you know, makes people think about things like, okay, because there's a lot of people, if instead of asking about empathy, we asked about independence, like who here feels that they're quite capable and independent, I'm sure there'd be many people go, well, me, you know, and is there therefore a trade-off that the independence has some effect on your ability to either be empathic or be seen that way? And I'm just asking the question based on what you've shared. Anybody else?
I thought it might be helpful if someone calls us empathetic or not empathetic, we find out what they're seeing, feeling that makes them use that word. And because there's times when I think I couldn't give a rat's ass, but I'm sitting and listening. Now, do they know I don't give a rat's ass, or I don't what? But I know I don't feel empathetic when my opening, after they've done their moan, groan, complain, and or they're talking about something, or I've just said something, and I just go, "Why are you crying?" You know, like that's one of our, we a lot of up completes. Up authenticates. We have this joke. We say, what happened with her? Oh man, I went right to why is she crying? Like we had no idea what the drama was. It wasn't a problem for us. So if I start thinking, why are you crying? I know I'm probably not in link with you right now.
And it wouldn't be because of anything you said, Greg.
How could they possibly have taken it that way? That's why I'm constantly thinking it's better that I check in with them and don't let me be the decider of whether I'm empathetic or not. So you know what, Lucia, I trust your people more than I trust that profile thing you did.
Well, it's interesting because when I thought about empathy, you know, preparing all of this, I thought it's probably a similar concept to being trustworthy. You know, if we said who considers themselves trustworthy, most people probably do, but it's not always how we're seen. And it's probably similar with empathy. That's why I think it's going to be really cool to dig into how our different IDs show up with empathy. And even I see Cheryl's comment here in the chat. By the way, guys, feel free to use the chat right up. It's not actually a distraction to the meeting. It's sort of like the other half of the meeting. There's a lot of gold that comes up in the chat. And we have some very skilled black belt consultants and coaches that respond in the chat as the webinar goes along and will bring it into this conversation too. So please feel free, if you feel more comfortable putting things in the chat, to do it that way. But Cheryl, the comment you made is a really good one. I mean, sometimes it tilts the other way, where people feel that they're too empathic, and as a result, they feel, you know, that they get too affected by other people, and to Cheryl's point, don't stand their own ground, or just get too emotionally affected by other people's stuff. So it can go both ways, both ends of the spectrum, being too empathic or not enough. Anyone else who's had feedback about not being empathic, or who has that doubts in themselves about their ability to be so? I see Jill's comment in the chat that sometimes she can't access it. It tends to depend and feels like a switch that either goes on or off. Do you want to share anything about that, Jill?
Just that it's disturbing, I guess. It feels wrong sometimes, and it just feels turned off, and at really maybe inopportune moments where it feels like it should be really on. And I don't know if that's an overwhelm, and it's like, or if I don't know where it's coming from. So I'm just curious about how the ID might play into that.
Okay. Well, let's find out. So what I'm going to do is I prepared some matrices of both your empathy strengths and empathy vulnerabilities. They're not complete. I intend completing them via this discussion today. So based on what people share, we'll learn more. So your sharing will be really valuable. And then we'll complete the matrices and send them out in the deck when we send out this to you afterwards. But one of the things I'll start with, let me just call the slides up again in a second, is that for a while now, we've been distinguishing between cognitive empathy and emotional empathy, because a lot of verifiers, firstly, I think the majority of people feel like they're empathic. And if we just take one dimension, being the verify drive, everyone's going to be either, you know, up on verify, like a 6, 7, 8, 9, they're going to be in avoid verify, or they're going to be in the middle. They're going to fall somewhere on that axis. And so even verifiers will feel very empathic. I think what's become quite evident is that the avoid verify drive is the naturally empathic drive. But many verifiers go, well, hang on a sec, I've got empathy, you know, but when they dig into it, there's a difference between the emotional empathy, the feeling that goes on, and the ability to understand and be cognitive about it, where you can rationalize it. You can maybe connect with it because you've experienced it yourself, so you understand what they're saying. But whether you feel the feeling is where there's a difference, right? So both are still valuable. Like, for example, when the verifier gets that cognitive understanding, their ability to give perspective can be really valuable in that conversation. But that's different to having the feeling. So that's just one example. Let me show the deck. And so I'm going to go through these drive by drive, but I'd like you to share whatever reactions you have, including you might want to debate some of the things that are up here. I'll explain them so you've got the context, and then we'll make sure we, if needed, reword them so that they land better. But there might be some things that aren't on here that you see as well, and we'll just capture them and add them into the mix. So you can see what I put up there, first of all, about the naturally cognitive empathy of the verifier for the understanding and the ability to rationalize what you're saying, compared to the avoid verifier, who just, you know, feels the feelings. And honestly, what you're feeling transfers to them. And that might be why, you know, you know, when people feel like I'm too empathetic with someone else, you know, their feelings affect me. I didn't even want that to happen. It's like an involuntary thing, but you end up absorbing whatever their emotion is. Now, that's wonderful when it's a great, you know, positive emotion, but when it's something more negative, and I've even experienced it where the person can be quite distant from you, but you hear something in the news, for example, and based on the energy of what you're hearing, your feelings and emotions are affected. And I guess that's the key word, affected. But here's some of the other strengths, you know, for the verifiers, this ability to bring perspective and put things back into perspective is massively helpful. Firstly, to other verifiers, because when they're in it, they can lose perspective, but especially to avoid verify people. That's a huge strength in having someone else feel empathy from you. Equally, for the avoid verifiers, you know, to both other avoid verifiers and to verifiers, feeling like we can share with no judgment and that wherever we're at is accepted, that's just huge. I might just stop there in case anyone has a question. Particularly if some of this might surprise you and you feel like, well, hang on, I'm one of those people and I feel differently. I thought that as a verifier, I do have emotional empathy, or I'm an avoid verifier and I don't think I'm all that empathic. So let's just talk about the verify connection to empathy for a little bit before we move on. Any questions or comments?
I'll speak up. The quandary I was talking about, like sometimes like the turning it on and off, because I'm avoid verify, but I think that it might be about my use authenticate that gets me right into the task and pulls me a little bit out of the feeling, the ability. It's kind of, and moving on, like and then also use improvise, like, come on, let's move this, as opposed to just sitting and being present with it. So maybe anyway, just kind of different shades of empathy and how it shows up.
I think that's probably right, Jill. We can expand on that in a minute when we get into the authenticate drive, but I think you're right, you know, and it's a conundrum because being an avoid verifier, you know, there is that initial emotional connection that you have, but you move both because of your authenticate drive, but then your other two drives, you know, avoid complete, you don't want to stay there very long. You improvise sees positivity, and hey, you know what we can do about that is, and so it's straight into action and future possibilities and positivity. And you might leave that space very quickly, the empathic space very quickly. It might be too quick for others, which is why they feel like, oh, could you have just stayed here with me for a little bit longer, you know?
Sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Amanda. Go for it.
Sorry. No, I was just going to add to what Jill was saying, because my husband is a 2738, and I see that a lot. If I'm going through something, his 7 plays more than the 2. So he finds it difficult to accept. I think he wants to help me. He doesn't want to see me struggling. So he moves on quickly from, okay, this is what you're feeling, but let's do that. And how about this? And he goes on to the improvise. He wants to see what's positive about that situation. He wants me to move through that quickly so that I'm not suffering. But when it's the other way around, I often find ourselves having a conversation and he'll say, can you just acknowledge what I'm saying? Like, just acknowledge what I'm feeling. Just say, yes, okay, I can understand. And I think it's because I'm trying to give perspective, or I'm also not wanting to see him suffer, and I want to move. So it's interesting how the other drives also play into it.
So as I listen to you, Amanda, one of the things that I'm making note of here is to be really empathic, no matter the style, it maybe includes staying in that space for what the other person needs. You know, I mean, just to put it in a time frame for a second, if they need you to be there for 10 minutes, but you've got an ID that wants to move on after 1, you know, doesn't, like, you might have been really empathic for the 1 minute, but part of being empathic is staying there for the length of time they need before they're then ready to maybe look at what do we do about it. And that's maybe something to be more conscious of, is not just that we're empathic, but how long are we staying in that space for? And is it long enough or maybe too long for the other person, you know?
And maybe checking in as well with the other
Yeah.
person, you know, like, do you want to talk about this more, or do you just want to get off your chest? You know, do you want me to provide solutions? And that is hard depending on what your ID is like, but I think that's important.
Thank you. Tristan, you're going to share something?
Yeah, I was going in a similar direction, you know, from a verifier perspective. I'm a use verify, and I find my natural ability and drive to want to solve the problem can come across not empathetic, I feel often, because it's like I just want to help in the best way I know how, but that's maybe not the best way sometimes. And I'm so I know we're talking about strengths here, but I feel it's both a strength and a weakness. So anyway, that was my thoughts as we were talking that through.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, Paul, I think on the flip side, as a verifier, if we don't do the things that you've listed there, then we're not empathetic towards that person or their situation, neither cognitive nor emotional. Because I think that's one way we actually show empathy, right? So I would exactly do that. Might give perspective, ask some questions, find out some detail. That is certainly the cognitive way of the verifier, to do the empathy, and then you look at the whole idea. I might say, look, what's the worst case for that person? You know, look, it isn't really so bad, you know, it could be worse, you know, and what do we do about it? Then the authenticate comes in. So that, but if I don't do that, then you can be sure I'm not empathetic with the person and their situation, neither cognitive nor emotional. I think, you know, I think it's very easy to figure out whether a person is empathetic or not. Yeah.
I think you make a good point, Peter, that if these are the strengths that you have in providing empathy, you know, just watching some of the comments in the chat and comparing them to what you're sharing here, maybe these are also the keys to being empathic for the different directions of the ID.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's how it's expressed. Yeah.
Like, I know for me as a verifier, when people are asking really good questions, like they're really curious to understand, then I feel like, yeah, okay, so you really do care, you know. And I'm see what Greg put in the chat about if he doesn't have to repeat himself, then people are really getting me then, you know, like, and I can see how that correlates to his ID. So the way we show this empathy is going to be, you know, there are our strengths, but then there's the needs that other people have for it are probably reflected through their strengths here. So let's move on and talk about the Authenticate drive. We've sort of started going there, but, you know, the strengths are that you don't let people get stuck in that space. I mean, you are keen to help and shift to action. But it also is helping people get clear. You know, it could just be through a question you ask. People often, when they're confused and upset about something, anxious about it, often they're not sure why. And one of the gifts of the Authenticate drive is your ability to help people get clear. And when they're clear, they feel like you really understand them. The Avoid Authenticate drive, I mean, one of the strengths is that ability to read the vibe, right? So there's often times your ability to pick something up before it's even shared, and that can make people feel like, wow, you really get me. I didn't even have to say anything for you to pick up something wasn't right. You may not know what it is, but you detected something was going on. And then just creating that safe space so people feel, yeah, it's okay to open up and share my truth here. However you do that, you know, that may not be the words you use. It could be the smile. It will vary from person to person. But one of the strengths is that ability to create that safe space. And then when you get into that deeper conversation, that's sort of where you live, you know, those sort of deeper, meaningful conversations, you enjoy being in that space. So it's, you know, that's where people want to go. It's comfortable for you and it makes it comfortable for them.
Paul, I just wanted to say you asked for feedback if something felt like it didn't quite land. And this is one of the things that challenged me when I learned that I was use authenticate is this distinction. You thrive on deep and meaningful conversations. That's where I live too, even as a use authenticate, but maybe it's a little bit more nuanced, like deep and meaningful conversations that are maybe like forward moving, like forward focus as opposed to wallowing, you know, but I love the deep and meaningful conversations. I don't actually want the shallow. So just to kind of distinguish.
Thank you, and I'll tidy the wording up when we produce these slides. So, is there another authenticator that could maybe help Jill understand the nuance of, you know, because you might also think, well, I enjoy the deep and meaningful conversations too, but what's the subtle difference for you being an authenticator compared to the avoid authenticate? Alona, I can see you're ready to go.
It's about timing. It's about timing. Like I really appreciate the deep and meaningful. Like I really, maybe you guys don't know that because that's not how I am at work sometimes, but it's about the timing of it. So right away feels awkward. Like, and if there are things to be done that I can be doing, I don't want to have the deep and meaningful if there's stuff I have to do. If I can get that off my plate, then I'll sit there and talk for hours. But there's something about, if there's something that has to be done, I have a hard time being in the deep and meaningful. I'm not sure that's clear, but that's how it feels for me.
Okay.
Can I just say, and with you, Alona, what I find is you actually, when you are ready to talk, and I find this with Patricia, but more so with you as well, I just find with both of you, you have to feel that the other person is really present for you, that they're really, really, really listening. So I find you'll talk and you are very empathetic, but you need to feel that people around you are actually very present to what's happening.
Yes. And Jill, the other one for me as authenticate is that it's got deep and meaningful. It's got to be real. If they're deep and meaningful is my cat just doesn't seem to want to eat this new expensive cat food. I'm why is she crying? You know? So it's got to be real. And I got to feel the real. It's not real for both of us. Then you can't get us away. Then we have to stay there until we've helped you somehow.
Yeah.
Does that make sense, Jill? Yeah.
Greg, when would it not be real?
When the topic at hand, what we're talking about is not what everyone's really feeling. Like if we're going deep and meaningful on something that there's an elephant in the room and we're talking about the wallpaper, and so I've got a sense of whoa, because you know that it's not authentic. It's just not authentic. It's like, well, why are we talking about this? And then
I completely agree. If it's all philosophical and what if and theoretically, and you know they might, and I'm like, are you making that up in your head? Because
right. I can't.
Alona, I just unmuted myself because I was going to say the same thing. I find if the conversation deep and real is like a philosophical, I'm not much into philosophical conversations, but if it's like, okay, let's get into real detail about what's going on here and what we're going to do about it, I'm all in. But if it's just philosophy, I'm like, you know, it's all subjective. I'm not getting anywhere with this.
go the authenticates.
Yep.
I would say so that means we're not very deep people, I guess.
No, I don't think so. I think that we. Oh! So see, I took you literally.
I forgot you're an 8. Okay.
I do remember, you know, a dear person to some of us who sadly passed away a couple of years ago, Don McDonald, whose ID was 4628, used to say to me many times, Paul, we're a surface dweller. We're surface dwellers. And I'm not saying he was right, but he sort of owned it, you know. And I'm trying to understand this distinction that you guys are making about the deep and meaningful, because I buy it. I'm not debating it. I'm trying to just understand the nuance.
I've got.
If, yeah, go ahead.
We're surface dwellers until we see the pearl, then we dive.
Yes, I was going to say, if it's something that's real and something that and this is, I'm talking for me, that I can affect, I can help with, I can do something about, then I can go very deep. But if it's superficial, or then no, don't, or it doesn't feel real, no.
I was talking to a college student a couple of months ago, and when she was talking about, oh, I'm feeling overwhelmed, or I'm really worried, and it was real because it was her feelings, I could have stayed there for 4 hours and like talked about it. When she's like, but if I don't get this degree, I'm not going to go to that school, and this is going to whatever. And I'm like, it was all this, like, there's nothing real there. Like, of course there's an other option, and whatever, but it felt like worrying for worry's sake, or somehow it felt like she was making something up that had no basis in reality. But when she was talking about her feelings and how it impacted her, I'm right there.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Right. Let's move on. So the complete drive. So one of the things that comes very naturally for completers is spending the time. And sometimes you've just got to be there, and then the conversation comes up. So that is one of the strengths. It's not anything you necessarily do, but because you've got the patience and the willingness to spend the time, it just allows it to flow out of other people. And so you might have a situation, people say, well, I always feel I can open up to you, because the way you make them feel is that if they open up, you will stay in the conversation with you. You're not wanting to jump out and jump somewhere else. So the time spent one is really important. And then when you recall things, you remember the little things. Like one of the things that comes up empathically with the completer is not even just in that moment, but when they share something, go, yeah, I remember you telling me that 2 years ago, or I remember. And so that recall makes people feel like, wow, you really, not only you really get me, but you really paid attention. Like you remember all that stuff, and it really helps them feel connected to you. And then the long-term support is, when you check in, or when you think down the track, to raise that point again. How are you going with that now? And they go, wow, you really cared. You remembered that. Or playing things out. They're the strengths that really help people feel an empathy from you. Now with the avoid completes, the strength is in the spontaneity, the instant availability, that people just throw something, and we'll get in together to talk about this topic, and then they were upset about something, and you just drop the whole agenda and focused on them. I mean, that sense of in the moment, the ability to pivot, that's just I've got like massive for so many people. I go into so many meetings where there's agendas, and I'm like, this isn't the real issue. The agenda was what everyone, might have thought the meeting was about and why we called the meeting. But once you get in there, there's something else. You can see it. And when an avoid complete is on, and they can make that pivot to deal with something in the moment, that's to me a real gift of their empathy. Now there might be other things as well. I'm keen to hear that, because I didn't have so many here that came out automatically. So any questions or comments about the complete or avoid complete?
I think with the avoid complete, we vote with our feet, meaning you see us there. You don't have to wonder whether we're on board, because we've got the other end of the shovel or something like that. It's like, to me, the difference is between like a friend that'll help you move and a friend that'll help you move the body. And when you know that they're in all in, they'll drop everything, Paul. That's a big thing, I think, for me. That you don't even question. You're not questioning it. You're into action with it.
I'm sort of stuck on body.
Yeah, we all were.
Oh, sorry.
I'm wondering how real you've been here, Greg.
I totally get you, Greg. I've got a saying with my best friend. That's our saying to each other. It's just like, yeah, I'd hide the gun. Like, no questions asked.
I'm missing the point, because I'm actually hearing authenticate when you talk, Greg, about being willing to help and so on, as opposed to what you mean by the avoid complete. Can you?
Okay, the difference for me, if I've mentioned to someone and they show me they're willing to do it right now, my complete drive goes, oh, good. It's when I'm helping, you're right, I'll be jumping in. I'm only going to be jumping in when it's a real thing to do. But for me to feel there that I'm feeling the empathy, it's like I don't have to explain myself a question, but we're in it. You know, and I've got a friend where I say, look, I've had an idea. He goes, well, first, yes. Now tell me what it is. You know, so I know Jose, I have to actually call Jose's wife to say, can he really say yes right now? Because he's just all in, right? So that's an empathetic thing for me. It's that they'll be there. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. What anything else on the avoid complete drive that you guys see? And maybe a way to think about this is, how else does it get shown to you? Because what this page is coming up as is to what Peter called out. This is how you interpret empathy from others. So there's that immediate action, spontaneous sort of in it together that Greg just referred to. How else do people show you empathy, or what else do you see as your strengths in that space?
I would say, and maybe this is saying the same thing in a way, but it's someone's willingness to prioritize in a I mean, it ties into the spontaneity a bit, but someone's willingness to prioritize what's happening and what's big in that moment. And I think as an avoid complete, I love to do that. There's a real joy of, like, you know, you are the top right now. There's something, you know, that's real and that you need from me, and just being able to demonstrate that someone is a priority in the moment above other things. Dropping the other jobs, dropping the other responsibilities.
Yeah, that's what I just dropped down. When they see you make those changes for them, that makes them feel like you really value them and connect to them. Yeah. Yeah, and I can see that in reverse. When people do that for you, you know, I think what you and Greg have been saying is that really is the definition of empathy for you guys as avoid completes. What are you thinking, Susie? I can see your mind ticking away. What's your addition?
Well, I'm thinking it's also just for me, it can be a huge vulnerability. So when I'm feeling like I want to be in that space, and that is how I might show my empathy, and I want to just help out, and I can jump in and get things moving and change. I think for some people in my life, it's too much. So it's really important. Like, this has been great for me just to realize that whilst that can be a really good thing, and it is something that I love, so I agree with that, as people showing that to me is perfect. But yeah, it's definitely a vulnerability as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's move on to improvise. So you can see here the things we put here about bringing hope. My God, that's got to be one of the most beautiful things that the improvisers bring to the table. That is really empathy, is just this sense of hope, especially in the darkest of situations. The positivity, inspiration, the confidence boosting that people get from you. They, you know, often they're sharing something that could be a little dark, looking for empathy because they're feeling somewhat defeated. And your way, and it's not always what you say. It's not about being smart with the right words or ideas. Sometimes it's just the smile, the fun, the joke you make that just makes them feel like, you know what, things aren't as dark, are they? And it just is oxygen for them, or challenging them. Sometimes it's that, and people say, you know what, I needed to hear that. Thank you. But it's that you take the risk of saying those things. Others might be thinking it, like avoid improvisers might be thinking it as well, but they may not want to take the risk of sharing it unless they felt really safe with you to do so. Like you might say it to a family member or something because you feel safer. But even then, maybe not always. For the avoid improvisers, I think this is something we've seen, you know, a lot, is this. Firstly, there's no pressure. You know, in fact, their desire and their need is to take pressure off of you. And then they don't make it about them. It's much easier, this concept of, you know, agenda off, appreciation on. It's much easier for the avoid improvisers, I think, to do that, because it's not about them. It's not their nature to make it about them. And that doesn't mean that the improvisers intentionally make it about them. It's just that we get ideas and we go, oh my God, that's like what happened to me the other day, you know, and you share a story about you, all of a sudden it's about you, it's not about them. So it's just a more natural thing for the avoid improvisers. What about you guys? What do you see in the improvise drive, either for the use or the avoid? Anything you would want to add or clarify?
Well, I think the obvious for the avoid improvise is, you know, whatever the situation is for the person, one of the thoughts that goes through my head is, what's the worst thing for them? You know, could it be worse? You know, it isn't actually so bad. Look, you know, okay, that might be the verify given perspective, but it's really that what's the worst case here? Yeah, that goes through my mind. Yeah,
that's good, Peter. Thank you.
Pretty simple, straightforward. So no.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Could be either cognitive or emotional, but more likely to be cognitive, I'd say. Yeah.
Yeah. So we go, Tristan.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I live with an avoid improviser, and her ability to kind of break it down, you know, rather than it. I like that ability to be able to sort of break down a problem into its, you know, it's not really the problem, but it's the, you know, what are the steps, you know, what is the logical progression of this to the point where it's going to get resolved. There's a unique ability in that to really see that it, you know, I think about where the avoid verify could blow thing, you know, could get things out of proportion. I feel like the improviser also has this innate, the avoid improviser also has this innate talent to be able to go, right, step by step, this is how we're getting there, you know, and these are the contributing factors to what's going on, you know, really get behind the reason for the issue. I've noticed that as some of my observations.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
I wonder sometimes if that can come across a bit clinical as an avoid improvise. So that it's like if you take the emotion out of it and actually make it to, you know, depending on the situation, I mean, I know that's not a strength, but it's potentially a vulnerability, is that I think if the avoid improvise takes the emotion out and just tries just the facts, it may, you know, maybe something we need to watch out for, because I think I can do that. You know, I can be very factual around it rather than going, oh wow, but that's terrible. I sort of, you know, it's more of like, okay, that we can fix that, which I can verify, but clinical is the word that I sort of came up with. Yeah.
That's a really good point, Ian, actually, because if we think about that in relation to empathy is all about the emotion. And so taking the emotion out means, is that a struggle area for the avoid improvisers? That's, as I heard you say, that I hadn't thought about it this way before, but is it an area that avoid improvisers struggle with? Because you see things more logically, more calmly, more sensibly, you don't make a big deal out of it. So do you actually have a bit of a reaction, you know, almost like an allergy to the concept of, and I'm not saying to be provocative, I'm really wondering, is it an area, just like the verifiers can struggle with the emotional element of empathy because they're trying to rationalize, is there something that's a real challenge for the avoid improvisers here with the very concept of empathy?
I think it's something we need to watch out for. I think it's definitely a watch out. I know personally it's something I need to be conscious of. I think I've talked, and it's the academic empathy. Like, you know, I can conceptualize what you feel, but I think it can also come across that you're actually trying to be logical, where sometimes empathy it's an emotion, because it's an emotion of what people are feeling. It can detract. People may be thinking you're not taking them as seriously, or not. You're not really empathizing. You're just being more, and come back to being clinical about it, and that could derail a conversation, or people may not be willing to go where they need to go.
Yeah, no, really insightful. I'm watching all the avoid improvisers. No one's getting.
I think you're beating yourself up like a true avoid improviser, Ian. But no, look, for 20 odd years, my understanding of the idea is that idea doesn't put people in a box or tells them what they can and can't do, but that's how they do it. And so I think this is still a way for the improvise, how the avoid improvise does show empathy. Yes, it is different to other drives, but I wouldn't beat ourselves up over it, because I think that's sort of really against the spirit of ID to say, how do you do this, rather than saying you can't do this. Yeah?
I don't think I was saying I can't. I was just saying it's something I need to watch out for. And again, that becomes an awareness piece for me with
how it's perceived.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, granted. Yeah.
I'll give you a perception on that. Bear is a force. So it's not the verified driving in, but sometimes she does something to smooth the moment or solve a drama or calm things down, and she misses a bigger picture, and it just becomes a clanker. But her intention is to fix it or solve it or calm it, and there's something that not being addressed, that it might look clinical or like she's really missed it. So the empathy is there to do something, but I think the improvised drive is trying to avoid going into the drama or avoid getting heated up, and that can look clinical as opposed to clinical because you got a solution, like you're solving the wrong thing, maybe. Does that make sense, Lee?
And I like the word diffuse. I think that's what would sort of go through. Like let's take that the drama out of it, so that we can actually get in and really help.
That's it.
And that piece, I think, is how it can be. Yeah, absolutely go the opposite way.
I think it's a really interesting point. I think it's a new dimension to that drive that maybe we're going to run out of time to really unpack this today. But when we come back to our masterclass in 2 weeks' time, I have another whole matrix on the vulnerabilities of which, we've sort of gone there a little bit, even in this last piece of the conversation, but the vulnerabilities of the different drives. But we could easily change the heading of this slide to the empathy needs of as I listen to what you've all shared, and we'll add a few things to this slide, but the needs for these different drives. And one of the real lessons, even for me, as I listen to the conversation and your reactions to things, is whilst empathy, as its definition is one definition, the way people experience it and the way that they need to get it from other people really varies depending on what their ID is, doesn't it? When you listen to the conversation today, it's really huge. And I actually think there's a lot that in that avoid improvise drive, what you've just been sharing, I think there are some nuances that we need to continue to explore, because when I think about the front, through COVID, the emotional impact on avoid improvise frontline responders, like our frontline workers and first responders, has been huge from a PTSD point of view. So there might be something about the way they're absorbing the empathy as opposed to the way they're showing the empathy, as it were. And I think as a masterclass, that'd be really interesting to dig into that next time. So for those who are new, our masterclass is on the same topic in a couple of weeks' time, but we dig into a lot more of the nuances and have the time for people to share some of their own experiences and also, like around this topic, and solve problems together. So guys, we're out of time. Can I remind you that our next ID certification program is coming up in April, on April 17 and 18, and also on May 1. It's 3 different stages to the certification, 3 different days. So April 17, 18, and May 1. If you're interested in that program, please let Ian Robinson know on the screen here. He will send you whatever you might need to better understand the program and to register. Otherwise, thank you for being here today. I will send out the slides that we've used. The couple that we haven't gotten into, I'll hold back and go through them in our next session. That will be on the vulnerabilities and some of the action steps that you can take to be more empathic. This has been a great discussion, guys. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of the day, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time. Take care.
You.
Thanks, everyone.